Amara was once a lover of chicken. At every family gathering, chicken was her go-to meal. She relished the rich, savory flavor of grilled, fried, or roasted chicken, and everyone knew her for her hearty appetite when it came to this particular dish. But recently, a strange shift occurred, and she began avoiding chicken altogether. It wasn't sudden, but it grew more apparent with time. At first, her family dismissed it as a phase, but when her refusal to eat chicken continued for weeks, they started to ask questions. Despite their curiosity, Amara remained tight-lipped. Her once cheerful expressions during meals had turned into a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. Friends and family tried to entice her with her favorite dishes, but she politely declined. The change was subtle yet deeply unsettling. Those close to her couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had happened, but Amara wasn't ready to talk. Little did they know, there was more to her silence than they could ever imagine. Growing up, chicken had been a staple in Amara's life. Sundays were sacred, marked by large family feasts that filled their home with warmth, laughter, and the mouth-watering aroma of her mother's expertly seasoned chicken. Amara's love for the dish was almost legendary among her family. Fried, grilled, or roasted, she would always be first in line for a piece, usually grabbing more than one with a satisfied grin. Chicken had a comforting, almost nostalgic place in her heart, a link to her happy childhood memories. But lately, that joy had been replaced with an unexplained feeling of dread. Though she hadn't told anyone, even the sight of chicken now made her uneasy. It was as if something within her had shifted, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Still, she couldn't explain it yet. Each time her family asked about her sudden change, she brushed off their concerns with vague excuses, holding back the real reason, a reason even she hadn't fully come to terms with. Amara's growing discomfort around chicken had become impossible to ignore. She wasn't just avoiding eating it, she also found herself unable to look at it for too long. Cooking smells that once brought her joy now triggered a nauseating sensation. Her family began noticing the subtle but definite distance she maintained from the kitchen whenever chicken was involved. Amara made sure to excuse herself when the meal was being prepared, often offering to set the table or attend to other tasks instead. Her mother, particularly concerned, watched closely but didn't press her for answers, yet. Amara's thoughts kept returning to the dream. Though she tried to dismiss it, its vividness was haunting. She didn't dare mention it to anyone who would believe her. Her inner conflict between maintaining a sense of normalcy and dealing with the growing anxiety kept her on edge. What had once been an ordinary aspect of life was now slowly unraveling into a silent, personal nightmare. The dream was unlike anything Amara had ever experienced before. It began innocently enough. She found herself standing in a familiar place, her family's chicken pen, where they kept a small flock for their personal use. But there was something eerie about the way the chickens moved, almost as if they were watching her. She called out to her mother, but there was no answer. Panic set in as she searched through the pen, feeling the urgency of something terrible about to happen. Then, out of the shadows, a chicken emerged, but it wasn't like the others. Its movements were familiar, almost human-like. Amara stared in disbelief as the chicken seemed to look at her with her mother's eyes. In a terrifying moment of realization, Amara understood that her mother had somehow transformed into one of the chickens, blending into the flock. She tried to reach out, to stop her mother from disappearing, but the other chickens swarmed around, clucking madly, and she lost sight of her. Amara woke up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the image from her mind. Days after the dream, Amara struggled with how to bring it up in conversation. Her mother had always been a grounded, sensible woman, not one to entertain wild notions or vivid imaginings. Amara feared the judgment that might follow if she shared the strange experience, so she kept it to herself. Yet, as time passed, the lines between reality and the dream began to blur. Every time she looked at a chicken now, she couldn't help but see her mother's eyes staring back. Amara became quieter around her family, more introspective, and more detached from meals. Her avoidance of chicken became a topic of light teasing at first, her father joking that she'd grown too sophisticated for the dish. But to Amara, it was far from a joke. Each meal became a psychological battle she barely managed to win. Still, she said nothing, and her family remained in the dark about the growing terror inside her. Amara's behavior didn't escape her mother's watchful eye. She had always been intuitive, able to sense when something was off with her daughter. At first, she respected Amara's privacy, believing that whatever was troubling her would pass in time. But now, weeks had turned into months, and the tension only grew. Her mother couldn't ignore the obvious discomfort Amara displayed whenever chicken was mentioned, let alone served. One evening, as they prepared a meal together, her mother gently pressed Amara for an explanation. "You've always loved chicken. What changed, Amara?" Her tone was soft, but her eyes were filled with concern. Amara's heart raced. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some excuse, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked away, muttering something about a change in taste. Her mother wasn't convinced, but she didn't push further. Amara knew she couldn't keep the truth buried much longer. Amara's avoidance of chicken was beginning to strain family dinners, and the pressure to reveal her secret weighed heavily on her. One evening, after a particularly tense meal, Amara decided to take a walk. The air outside was cool and calming, but her thoughts were far from settled. As she wandered toward the backyard, something strange caught her eye: the chicken pen. Normally, it was a place of routine for the family, but tonight, it felt ominous. Drawn to it by an unknown force, Amara found herself standing at the entrance, staring at the chickens as they moved around aimlessly. But one chicken stood apart from the others. It didn't peck at the ground like the rest, instead, it stood perfectly still, watching her. Amara's breath caught in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she swore it had her mother's eyes. She blinked, shaking off the unsettling thought, but the strange connection lingered. That night, the dream returned, more vivid than ever. Amara found herself back in the chicken pen, searching desperately for her mother. The chickens clucked in a frenzy, their movements erratic and unsettling. As she ran between the scattered flock, she suddenly heard her mother's voice, soft, pleading. It was coming from one of the chickens. Amara turned, and there, among the chickens, was her mother, unmistakably transformed. The terror of the scene consumed her as her mother's voice echoed in her mind, begging for help, but there was nothing she could do. Amara jolted awake, her heart racing, drenched in sweat. The dreams were becoming more frequent, and each time, they seemed to pull her deeper into their grasp. She had hoped ignoring them would make them go away, but it was clear now that she had to face them. The next morning, Amara made a silent decision. She would return to the chicken pen, not just in her dreams, but in real life. Something there was calling to her, and she had to find out what it was. After breakfast, she slipped out of the house and made her way to the backyard. The chickens clucked softly as she approached, their beady eyes following her every move. She hesitated at the entrance, a wave of nausea rising in her chest. Forcing herself forward, Amara stepped into the pen. The familiar, earthy smell of the chicken surrounded her, but this time, it felt oppressive. She scanned the flock, looking for something, anything that could explain the strange dreams. But all she saw were chickens, pecking away as usual. Amara sat at the dinner table, the familiar scent of her mother's seasoned chicken filling the room. Everyone was enjoying the meal, but Amara's plate remained untouched. Her family had long since stopped asking her about it, but she could feel their curiosity hanging in the air. Her mother, especially, watched her closely, sensing there was something Amara hadn't told them. Amara shifted uncomfortably, her mind flashing back to the the vivid nightmare that had changed everything. How could she ever explain it to them? How could she open her mouth and tell them that, in her dreams, her own mother had turned into a chicken, looking at her with pleading, human eyes? It was absurd, unthinkable, and she knew they wouldn't understand. They would think she was losing her mind. The weight of the secret pressed down on her, but she remained silent. Some truths were too strange to share. Later that evening, after dinner, Amara found herself alone in her room. She sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the dream in her mind for what felt like the 100th time. It had been months since the first dream, and yet the fear it had stirred within her was still fresh, lingering like a shadow. She hadn't eaten chicken since then, and the sight of it now filled her with a quiet dread she couldn't explain. But how could she possibly tell her family? Her mother, who was so practical and down-to-earth, would never understand. She could already picture the look of concern, maybe even disbelief, if she tried to explain. "I stopped eating chicken because I dreamed you turned into one." The words would sound ridiculous, even to her. No, this was a burden she would carry alone. Amara knew what she had to do. She would bury the secret deep within herself, lock it away where it couldn't harm anyone else. There was no need to share it, no need to burden her family with something they would never believe. It was easier this way, safer. The next morning, Amara made her way to the backyard. She stood near the chicken pen, watching the birds as they moved around, pecking at the ground. They were just chickens, she told herself. Simple, harmless creatures. But in her mind, she could still see the strange, haunting image from her dream, her mother, transformed, staring at her with those familiar, human eyes. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was just a dream, nothing more. She had to let it go. Amara turned away from the pen, her steps purposeful as she walked back toward the house. She would never tell her family about the dream. It was too strange, too unsettling, and the truth wouldn't help anyone. It was better this way, keeping the secret to herself, leaving the past behind. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least, as normal as it could be. Amara still avoided chicken at every meal, but her family had stopped questioning it. Her mother, though still curious, had decided to let the matter rest, and for that, Amara was grateful. The strange tension that had once hung over family dinners gradually faded, though Amara knew the mystery of her sudden change would always linger in the back of their minds. But for Amara, the secret remained buried, as tightly locked away as the memory of the dream itself. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. Whatever had happened in that dream, whatever strange connection she had felt, was something she would carry alone. And as the days turned into months, the memory of the dream began to blur, its sharp edges softening with time. Yet, deep down, Amara knew it would never truly leave her. It would remain a quiet part of her, a secret she would carry in silence, hidden from the world. But that was something she could live with. Amara consciously decides to keep the unsettling dream to herself, unable to bring herself to share it with her family due to how bizarre it sounds. She moves forward, accepting that some things are best left unsaid, even though the dream continues to haunt her. In the end, Amara found a strange peace in her silence. Though the unsettling dreams had left a lingering mark, she learned to live with the unease. Gradually, she accepted that some fears could not be explained or shared without risking misunderstanding or doubt. Keeping the dream to herself became both a burden and a way of safeguarding her family's peace.